Hi, this is Andrea Kane, and I am here with HSC 114 Medical Terminology. We are studying the Language of Medicine 12th edition by Davy Ellen Chadner. We are now on week 6, and week 6 is all about the nervous system. That's chapter 10, if you're keeping track in terms of your book. So, and if you're also looking at your syllabus, we are now on objectives 9.6.1 through 9.6.8, and that's the nervous system if you look in your syllabus. Okay, so what are our goals? They are the same as always when we talk about a body system. They're looking at the major organs and their functions, combining forms, suffixes, prefixes, what can go wrong with the system that we're studying, any lab tests, clinical procedures, abbreviations that are applicable, as well as medical terms in their proper context. So let's get going. Let's talk about the nervous system and move forward. All right. Nervous system is very complex. I wish they put very, very in front of the word complex. There are over 10 billion nerve cells in our bodies. They have voluntary and involuntary functions. And you think about that. Voluntary means, oh yes, I'm willing to do that. I step forward. I do it of my own accord. Involuntary means, it's against my will. You make me do it, whether I want to or not. It's involuntary. Nervous system cells, those nerve cells, carry electrical messages. That's really important to know. Next week, we're going to be talking about the cardiac system, and there's quite a bit of electrical activity that goes along with the heart. And so it's a really good introduction this week for us to be going over the nervous system, and then next week, the cardiovascular system. There are internal and external receptors. Nerve cells are called neurons. They are microscopic. They are collected into macroscopic nerves, and they carry electrical messages all over the body, everywhere. There are two major divisions that we need to know about. The first one is the central nervous system, the CNS, and that includes the brain and the spinal cord. Those are the main organs, so to speak, in the central nervous system. Then you have your peripheral nervous system. That's everything that comes out from the brain and the spinal cord. Your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves, your plexuses, and peripheral nerves throughout the body. All the ones that reach all the way to your fingertips. Yes. Or eyelashes. You think of some of the little tiny pieces and parts that are able to convey a sense of touch. That is all part of the nervous system. Your cranial and spinal nerves have three kinds of nerves. So be thinking about this. Cranial and spinal nerves, they have sensory nerves, and they carry messages toward the brain. So they sense things, and then they take the message to the brain. Your motor nerves, on the other hand, are coming away from the brain with messages from the brain that are being taken somewhere to do something with. So if you think of a car, it's driving that message away from the brain to deliver it. Sort of like a food delivery vehicle, except it's a message delivery vehicle. So think motor, and that will be messages away from the brain. Senses, you touch it, and that sends a message to your brain. So sense is to, motor is from, and then you have mixed nerves that can do both. They can carry the sensory as well as the motor messages. And then you have sensory receptors. You have what's called an autonomic nervous system. And this carries impulses from the central nervous system to the organs. Okay? So your autonomic nervous system is going to send those impulses from your central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord, to the organs. Your sympathetic nerves stimulate your body when it's under stress. So they're sympathetic to your stress. Your parasympathetic nerves balance your sympathetic system to slow down your heart rate and lower your blood pressure. So if you are in fight or flight mode, if you've ever heard those terms, fight or flight, you've got all this adrenaline rushing through your body, and it's stimulating it under stress. That's your sympathetic system. Your parasympathetic nerves come in and say, oh, slow down. It's going to be all right. No need to panic. It's going to be okay. Slow that heart down. Lower that blood pressure. It's all good. It's all right. Think of it as your sympathetic is your hyperactive inner child that's ready to run or hide or jump or play or do whatever. And your parasympathetic is the one who comes and gives them a gentle, calming hug saying, it's okay, we can be quiet, it's good for us. Take a few minutes, take a break, catch your breath. This is a really good visual for how it is set up. So again, let's talk about this. You've got your central nervous system, that's your brain and spinal cord. And then you have your peripheral nervous system, which is 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and then those autonomic nerves that stimulate or destimulate, so to speak, your organs. And that's where you get into the sympathetic nerves that say, oh, run, run, quick, hide, do this, fight back, do that. They're very active nerves. And then you have your parasympathetic nerves that come and give you that big hug and say, it's okay to be quiet. It's okay to sit down. It's okay to catch your breath. Everything's going to be all right. And so hopefully those two things balance each other out as well as act at different times in your life to help you. A neuron is an individual nerve cell made up of a dendrite, a cell nucleus, and an axon. And within the axon is the myelin sheath and neurolemma. You have terminal end fibers that secrete neurotransmitters, and then those neurotransmitters are the ones that actually move that impulse across what's called a synapse. And another term you need to know is a ganglia, and that's a small cluster of nerve cell bodies. So you have an individual neuron, and then you have these clusters of neurons called ganglia. And again, we talked about the parts of a neuron include dendrites, cell body, cell nucleus, axon, myelin sheath, terminal end fibers, and synapse. And here's a good image for us on this topic. It shows the parts of the neuron. So you can see at the top, you've got those little, they're kind of like the ends of a branch, a tree branch, the twigs on there. And they're called dendrites, and they're pulling in that stimulus. And they pull it into the cell body, and there's the cell nucleus, through the axon, which is covered in the myelin sheath, sort of like a protector and supporter, and increases the speed of that impulse going through there, to the terminal fibers. And the terminal fibers are between nerve cells, and there you see the little black dots. If you look right over here, you see the little black dots between the nerve cells. Those are neurotransmitters, and they're in an area, a gap called the synapse. And so you start with that stimulus up here in the dendrites, and it moves through the nerve cell, down through the axon, to the terminal fibers. It gets down to the terminal fibers, and neurotransmitters will pull it across the synapse and into the next cell. And this shows you here how the neurotransmitters are, and there are receptors, and there's even an inactivator, and so you can see some of the detail there. Glia cells maintain the health of the nervous system and do not transmit impulses. So that's just something to keep in mind as we go through here. You have 4 types. You have your astrocyte, or an astroglial cell, a microglial cell, an oligodendroglial cell, and an epididymal cell. All right, so you've got those. Make sure that you're aware of those. Now we're going to move on to the brain, the good old brain that we all need and rely quite a bit on. The structures of the brain include the frontal lobe, the sulci, the gyri, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, the Wernicke area, temporal lobe, and Broca area. And here is a good visual for us on the different parts of the brain. You can see the different lobes. The frontal lobe is exactly where you would expect it, the front of your head. The parietal lobe is toward the back of your head. Occipital is the very back. And then you've got the temporal on the side. And you can see what each part does. You can look at that to see what they specialize in, so to speak. And that's why you can, if you think about a stroke and it affecting a specific part of your brain, say you get a stroke in your occipital lobe, how it's going to affect your vision. Or maybe you have a stroke in the Wernicke area and that's going to affect your language comprehension after that stroke. Cerebrum is the largest section of the brain. The surface nerve cells are called cerebral cortex, and it manages your speech, vision, smell, movement, hearing, and thought. Cerebellum is what coordinates your voluntary movements and maintains balance. And your thalamus integrates and monitors the impulses coming from your skin. They're what are able to detect pain or translate that sensation into pain. Hypothalamus controls your body temperature, sleep, appetite, sexual desire, and emotions. It regulates the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. It monitors your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So it does an enormous amount. In your brainstem, there's something called the pons. It bridges the cerebrum and cerebellum with the rest of the brain. It houses the nerves for your face and eyes. And there's also a part of midbrain, the uppermost portion of the brainstem, and that contains pathways that connect the cerebrum with the lower portions of the brain. So a lot of connections take place in the pons. The medulla oblongata is what connects the spinal cord to the brain. There are nerve tracts from side to side, and it regulates your blood vessels, heart, and respiratory system. So let's take a look at your spinal cord. This is a cross section of your spinal cord. Okay, so let's let us figure out where we are. Anterior is going to be front, so this is what faces toward your throat, your front of your neck. Posterior, this is what is on your back side, on the back of your back. And you can see how you have some skeletal muscle that's attached to nerve fibers, and it's taking this information and it's coming up through, and it's passing the message along. Whoops, sorry. I'm sorry, I started that backwards, didn't I? Wasn't paying attention. Pardon me about that. All right, so skin sensation, that's where it's got those nerve fibers. It's taking it through the afferent nerve, through the dorsal root ganglion and the dorsal root into here, which is the gray matter. And in the gray matter, it is sort of being translated, what have you. And if there's a message there that's going to go back, it's going to come back out through an afferent neuron. So make sure you know afferent, AFF, is going toward the brain or the spinal cord, and the efferent is bringing the message back away for some type of activity. So make sure you at least are very familiar with this piece. And again, afferent is another word for sensory, and we talked a little bit about sensory. It's taking those messages to the brain or spinal cord. And efferent is the same as motor, and motor is bringing that message away from the brain or the spinal cord to somewhere so it can do something. Your meninges contain the dura mater, subdural space, arachnoid membrane, subarachnoid space, and pia mater. And this gives you a back view. If someone took off the back of their head, if they had, let's say they had a zipper and they just unzipped, here is what you would be looking at the back of their head if that was removed. You could see the different layers as you go through. You can see that dura mater and pia mater. You can see the subarachnoid space that has the cerebrospinal fluid in it, and you can see the subdural space. If you've ever heard of someone having a subdural hematoma, what it means is they have a buildup of blood that has pooled in that subdural space. Sometimes when someone's very elderly and they have a bad fall and they hit their head, they have a subdural hematoma, and that would be an example of where you would see that. So this gives you an idea of where the spinal cord is actually coming up out of the spine and going through, and how it's attached to the brain itself and bringing all that information up there. So let's talk vocabulary. Acetylcholine, afferent nerve, arachnoid membrane, astrocyte. And notice that it's transporting water and salts from the capillaries. What does that remind you of? What did we study a few weeks back when we studied the urinary system? We studied kidneys and how they filter water and salts, and they put those back into the bloodstream. And this is one of those places where those waters and salts actually go through the capillaries. Autonomic nervous system, axon, blood-brain barrier. And this is important to know, especially if you go into the oncology field. And we'll be studying a chapter on oncology. I think it's the last one that we study in this course, so it'll be week 15, I think. Whoops, went a little too fast. Brainstem, cauda equina. Cell body, central nervous system, cerebellum. Cerebral cortex, cerebrospinal fluid, cerebrum. Cranial nerves, dendrite, dura mater. Afferent nerve, ependymal cell. Ganglion, or ganglia if it's plural. Glial cell, or neural glial cell. Gyrus, gyri, notice the plural. Hypothalamus. Medulla oblongata. Meninges, you've heard of meningitis? That's inflammation of the meninges, usually due to an infection of some sort. Could be bacterial, could be viral, but it's due to an infection. And it is a very serious one. It can cause death. Microglial cell. And it's interesting, isn't it? It removes waste products from the central nervous system. Again, if you think back to our urinary body system that we studied a few weeks ago, how the kidneys remove waste products. This is a type of cell that does it for the central nervous system. Midbrain, motor nerve, myelin sheath. If you've ever heard of muscular sclerosis, one of the problems with that disease is that it damages, removes, strips away the myelin sheath. And that's what makes it such a progressively destructive disease. Nerve, neuron, neurotransmitter, oligodendroglial cell. Parasympathetic nerves, parenchyma, peripheral nervous system. Pia mater, plexus or plexuses, and notice the difference in plural. I would have expected plexi from some of our others, but it's not, it's plexuses, so watch out for that. Pons, Receptor, sciatic nerve. If you've ever heard of sciatica, that is a condition of pain, severe pain with that nerve. Sensory nerve, spinal nerves. You have 31 pairs. Stimulus, stimuli, stroma. Sulcus or sulci, sympathetic nerves, synapse, thalamus, vagus nerve, ventricles of the brain. A sheet of nerve cells that produces a rounded fold on the surface of the cerebrum is called, I'm gonna let you look this up. We just covered this not too long ago. It was definitely in your vocabulary. The thin, delicate inner membrane of the meninges. If I were you, I'd go back and take a look at that visual we had about the back of the head. Hint, hint. All right, combining forms. Remember our equation, our mathematical equation here. It is a root plus a combining form, or combining vowel equals a combining form. Sorry, root plus combining vowel equals combining form. Cerebello, cerebro, duro, encephalo, glio, lepto, meningo or meningio, myo, myelo, neuro, ponto, radiculo, thalamo, theco, vago, algizo is a combining form, but then you have algesia, which is a suffix. Algia, causo, comato, aesthesio or aesthesia, that's another one. Aesthesio is the combining form. Aesthesia is a suffix. Kinesio, and kinesio is also combining form. Kinesia is that suffix. If you think about a kinesthetic learner, they like to be moving. My son is that way. He can learn so quickly when he's moving. And so think movement with kinesio or kinesia. Kinesis and kinetic, more of those forms for movement. Lepsy, lexo, paresis, phasia. Now don't get this mixed up. Remember we started phagia, and that was with a G back in the digestive system, and that means swallowing. So if it's a G, it's a swallow. If it's an S, it's speech. Plegia, praxia, sthenia, syncopo, taxo. Which term means nerve pain? Nerve pain. This should be a fairly easy one. Which type of hematoma occurs between the skull and the dura as a result of a ruptured meningeal artery, usually after the fracture of the skull? And again, I encourage you to go back and look at your layers. Look at that illustration that showed you the back of the head, looking at those layers, and take a look at that. So what can go wrong with the nervous system? Unfortunately, there are quite a few things. There are some that even begin before birth with congenital disorders. There's hydrocephalus and spinal bifida. And there's two types of spinal bifida. One is cystica and occulta. And your book should have more on those, or if you're interested, go ahead and Google those and see what those are. Then you have degenerate movement and seizure disorders. You have everything from Alzheimer's disease to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Have you ever heard of Lou Gehrig's disease? He was a famous baseball player, I think in the 1930s, who was one of the very first that they identified this awful, horrible, fatal disease with. And, you know, if you're interested at all in baseball, old baseball players, and this disease, it would be well worth looking that up to see about that. Epilepsy is a form of problematic disease involving the nervous system. Something's going wrong. Not necessarily disease, but something's going wrong with the nervous system. And epilepsy and seizures are all part of that. Huntington disease, multiple sclerosis, which I already mentioned, myasthenia gravis, palsy, and there are several types of palsy, including Bell's palsy you may have heard of, which is really a temporary palsy. Palsy can include just basic tremors. Sometimes in the elderly, they just have tremors, and that's a type of basic palsy, where something with the nervous system is just not working the way it's supposed to be, or the way it's perceived to be as normal. Parkinson's disease. We've heard a lot about people who have suffered from Parkinson's disease. There are not many, but there are a handful of famous celebrities who suffer from that. And they have been very vocal and open about their struggles. And so that's also very interesting to note how their nervous system issues are affecting them and their ability to do their work. Tourette syndrome is also a nervous system disorder. There are infectious diseases that can attack the nervous system, including herpes zoster. If you've ever heard of the elderly who get shingles, I know a couple of people who do that are older than me, thankfully, but they do get the shingles, and that is extremely painful. If you can catch the symptoms when they're coming on, usually within the first 24 hours, and reach out and get help, there are injections and that they can give you. There's vaccination that has increased in its efficacy, and that can really cut a shingles episode down. But sometimes if you don't catch it, it can take months to resolve itself, and that is a miserable, painful situation for whoever suffers from it. We talked a little bit about meningitis, some type of an infection that's going on with the meninges. It can be bacterial or viral. HIV encephalopathy is considered a nervous system disorder. That's where the HIV virus is causing issues with the brain. Traumatic disorders. Unfortunately, sometimes trauma happens, and that can impact the nervous system. Something that's talked about a lot now are traumatic brain injuries or concussions that happen, usually related to sports. But they can also happen from car accidents. They can happen from a bad fall, all those types of things. There's what's called a cerebral concussion, and that's a traumatic brain injury caused by a blow to the head. There's usually no evidence of structural damage to the brain tissue, and the person needs to rest. They need to be quiet. They need to lay down. They just need to let healing take place without a lot of activity, movement, noise, those types of things. A cerebral contusion is a bruising of the brain tissue as a result of direct trauma to the head. It can be associated with a fracture of the skull, edema, which is that swelling, and increased intracranial pressure. Subdural and epidural hematomas can occur, leading to permanent brain injury. So very serious things here when you're talking about cerebral concussions or cerebral contusions. Very serious. Vascular disorders. You can have issues with blood flow to the brain, within the brain, coming back from the brain. There are different types of strokes that can happen with the brain. There's a thrombotic stroke where you get a blood clot in the arteries leaving the brain. There's embolic, where a dislodged blood clot travels to the cerebral arteries and causes the stroke. Or there's hemorrhagic, where a blood vessel breaks, heavy bleeding occurs, and that's what causes the CVA or the stroke. And this is a visual of the different types of things that happen, those three types of strokes versus a normal one. So well worth looking at and understanding. All right, what are some clinical procedures that are done on the nervous system? Well, there are some x-rays that can be done. Often they involve the CT. There's cerebral angiography, and we'll talk more about angiography when we get to the cardiac system next week. There are procedures like MRI, PET scan, EEG, and the EEG is looking at the electrical activity of the brain. Just like we'll look at an EKG, which is the electrical activity of the heart. Doppler ultrasound studies can be done as well. And now we're on to abbreviations. And there are quite a few abbreviations, as you can see here. And more abbreviations. All right, so it's asking us which symptoms signal nervous system problems. How do you know when the nervous system is having a problem? What tests are conducted to diagnose those problems? Why would an MRI and an MRA be ordered? What's the difference between the imaging of the organ versus an angiography, which is looking at blood flow? I gave you the answer there. And some common pathologies of the nervous system. So think back to what we just covered. All right, review sheet. These are combining forms again. Algizo, angio, causo, cephalo, cerebello, cerebro, comato, cranio, cryo, duro, encephalo, aesthesio, glio, hydro, kineso, lepto, lexo, meningo, meningio, myo, myelo, narco, neuro, oligo, ponto, radiculo, spino, syncopo, taxo, thalamo, fico, tropho, vago. And that is it for this chapter. So I hope that you are doing well. I hope you have a great week ahead and enjoy the nervous system. And we will be back next week to talk about the cardiac system. So if you're if your interest lies in cardiology, stay tuned for week 7. All right, take care. Bye.